good morning. It's good to be with you, and we continue on our Discourse series. There are still parables to talk about. We have not finished them just yet. As we're working through these parables, what you'll notice, and we've been constantly trying to do, is at some level trying to rescue some of these parables from the domestication that they've suffered from. We hear them, they're familiar. We know that these parables sort of exist. And what starts to happen over time is we start hearing them differently because they're so domesticated to us. The parable that I'm talking about this morning is one that I've known since I was a little child. I've heard this talked about, explained to me. And what I notice in the way that it's explained to me is the parable is presented as quite easy to understand and make sense of. It's culturally applicable. It makes perfect sense. It works within my contemporary climate, the culture that I live in. And in truth, the parable's not really that shocking. Or so it seems at first. And what I want you to do is this for me this morning. If you're okay at just kind of leaning in with this with me, I'm going to say the name of the parable in just a moment. And what I'd love for you to do before I say anything else, I'd just like you to sort of hold on for a second and go, hey, what do I think this parable is about? There's two versions of this parable in the Bible, one in Matthew's gospel, one in Luke's gospel. I'm going to give you the name from Matthew's gospel just because I'm in a kind of generous, kind mood this morning. I want to give you the famous name. Is that okay? Like, come on, work with me here. Like, this is me. I'm trying to be nice. I've got another whole sermon if you want. The parable that I'm going to say the name of, I just want you to take a moment and remember, what do you think this parable is about? And so the parable we'll be talking about this morning is the parable of the talents. What does that bring to mind? What does that story mean? And maybe you're sat here this morning and you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about because I've never heard of the parable of the talents, all right? Now that's going to work great for you today because that means you don't need to get out of one way of thinking about it and into another way. So it's brand new for you, so you are in luck. It's one of those rare moments where not knowing something really helps you. In Luke chapter 19, the parable is known as the parable of the coins. But you'll see as you hear the story, they're essentially the same parable. People wonder, did Jesus tell it differently in one context, maybe in Luke? Anyway, we don't need to get into that. Here it goes. As they were hearing these things. So hold it just there for a second. What things? Where are they? Who are they? Who are we talking about now? Where are we when this parable is going on? That's probably the sort of question you should ask at some point as to what is actually being said here. But however, Jesus proceeds to tell them a parable because he was near Jerusalem and the people thought that the kingdom of God was going to appear at once. So again, you see Luke beginning to sort of set you up right from the start. So Jesus began to tell a discourse. Jesus began to tell a story that was probably going to knock people off track. And you see Luke set the story up for you a little bit here because he's like, people thought that Jesus was going to do this. Have you noticed in the New Testament that whenever people think they know what Jesus is going to do, they're probably wrong? It seems to be like if Jesus asks you a question, your first answer, probably the wrong answer. And even if you're one of Jesus' disciples, like that seems to just increase the likelihood of you being wrong, right? Because so often we think we know what Jesus is going to do, and then he does a different thing. So he tells them a story. He's near Jerusalem. People think they know how things are going to work. His story goes like this. A man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then to return. So he called 10 of his servants and he gave them 10 minas. A mina was a coin. And he said, put this money to work until I come back. But his subjects hated him and sent a delegation after him to say, we don't want this man to be our king. Now, notice a couple of things that are going on in this parable. And you sometimes have to do this when you read parables. But in 4 BC, Herod the Great died, and it wasn't known as 4 BC back then because of, well, you can figure that out. Herod the Great died, and his son decided that he was going to become king. They weren't a king in the way we would understand kings in this day and age. So the son had to go to the Romans and have their approval that he become the new king. The Jewish people didn't really like Herod the Great, so they had a kind of sort of idea that probably his son wasn't going to be all that much better. Because sometimes you're going to find this difficult to believe, that a leader can be a man, and that leader can have a son, and his son might not be a leader that you like. I realize that never happens today. I'm British. I have no idea why that's funny. But sometimes people don't like this new guy. So they sent, the Jewish people sent a delegation to the Romans chasing down Herod's sons to say, we don't want him to be our son, our king. I'm back there again. We don't want him to be our king. So that's a true story. So when people hear this in the time of Jesus, when people hear this story while Jesus is telling it, they go, oh, we know this story. We're familiar with this story. This is what happened back then. But of course, Luke is doing something really clever, and he does this all the time, that there's like a second level to this drama. There's something else going on. You see, because they're near Jerusalem, and Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And what's going to happen to Jesus when he gets to Jerusalem? Well, he's going to be made king. But of course, he's going to be made king by dying on a cross. So it's a little different in the story. And Jesus is going to come back. He's going to return after he dies on that cross. And he's going to be raised from the dead. And so Jesus kind of leans this double level drama here. This sounds like a story we've heard, but it's also a different story that is yet to come. And of course, many people decide that they want Jesus crucified. So actually the story of this rejection of this king is floating around in there. This is one of the few parables of Jesus where you really see the kind of bleed really clearly into his contemporary life. So this king leaves, and he leaves them 10 minas. A mina is about a 60th of a talent. It's a form of currency. In Matthew's version, he talks about these talents that are left behind. A mina is about a 60th of that. A mina is essentially 100 denarii. And one denarius is how much you would get paid for a day's work. So a 1 mina coin is a coin worth roughly just over 3 months' salary. This is not an insubstantial amount of money. This money has some weight to it. And he tells them something. Just spot this, what he tells them to do. Put this money to work, he said, until I come back. He was made king, however, and returned home. Then he sent for the servants who he had given the money in order to find out what they had gained with it. The first one came and said, Sir, your mina has earned 10 more. Well done, my good servant, his master replied, because you have been trustworthy in a very small matter. Take charge of 10 cities. The second came and said, Sir, your mina has earned 5 more. His master answered, you take charge of 5 cities. Now notice, there's a little side note onto the parable. This parable, I need to interrupt it a lot. I get really excited about this parable. Sorry about that. So notice a little side note that's going on here. If you're reading a lot of parables with us, if you're tracking our Discourse series with us, there's a kind of unsaid question here from this king. What have you done with the free gift? Another word for gift in the New Testament is grace. What have you done with the grace of acceptance that you have been given? Because you got 10 servants, got 10 coins, right? For free. And they were just told to put it to work. They didn't earn it. They didn't establish themselves in a particular way to get it. It was simply a question, what have you done with what you were given for free? So the first one says, Sir, your mina has earned 10 more. Well done, my good servant, because you have been trustworthy in a small matter. Now, this is where I think we start to get off track straight away with a parable like this. Because what tends to happen when we read this as Westerners particularly is our consumer culture, our culture, or rather our economic of success, quickly obscures what the king actually says to the servant. So when we read this story as modern people, what we immediately get distracted by, and maybe this was true in Jesus' time as well, and maybe, just maybe, this is the trick of the parable. We immediately get distracted, maybe and extracted. Now we've just gone into dentist metaphors. I'm trying out some new teeth, and it's just causing me some issues today. We immediately get distracted by 10 more and 10 cities. Wow, look at this guy. Look at his investment. This guy's portfolio was clever. He knew what he was doing, and he's got 10 cities now because of 10 minas, 1,000 days of salary. But the king doesn't commend the servant for that. he commends him for being trustworthy. He commends him for being faithful. The Greek word is pistos. Now, you say that very carefully in polite company, okay? Our Greek lecturer gave us a great mnemonic to remember that, but I'm never going to share it from a stage. The Greek word pistos means belief. It means faith. It means trust. So you have been worthy of belief. You have been faithful. You have been trustworthy. Notice that the commendation of this master isn't to do with how much, it's to do with how. And we too often miss this, particularly in capitalistic contexts. The parable is seen as perpetuating this myth that hard work equals success. And if you just work hard, you will get success and beneficial return. We love this in capitalistic culture. We believe that this is how the world works. If you work hard, then great things will happen to you. I mean, it's a myth that's disproved daily in Africa, but we consider that it's true in the Western world, and we keep pushing it, and we still keep living by it, and we keep telling our children that this is how things work. But this parable isn't supporting a capitalistic worldview. To be fair, it's not supporting a socialist worldview either. Neither of those worldviews are biblical, and neither of them are kingdom. This parable doesn't want to talk about that. It wants to talk about trust. Do you have ears to hear? Jesus might say. Another servant came and said, "Sir, here is your mina. I have kept it laid away in a piece of cloth. I was afraid of you because you are a hard man. You take out what you did not put in and reap what you did not sow." His master replied, "I would judge you by your own words." That's a little side point again here. You are a hard man, right? I feel like just working some language stuff with you. The Greek word here is austeros, where we get the word austerity from. You're a man of austerity, he says. You're a hard man. Let me not interrupt anymore. Let me just read this parable to its end. The master replied, "I will judge you by your own words, you wicked servant. You knew, did you, that I am a hard man, taking out what I did not put in and reaping what I did not sow? Why then did you not put my money on deposit so that when I came back I could have collected it with interest?" And then he said to those standing by, "Take his mina away from him and give it to the one who has 10 minas. Sir," they said, "he already has 10. He replied, I tell you that to everyone who has, more will be given. But as for the one who has nothing, even what they have will be taken away. But those enemies of mine who did not want me to be king over them, bring them here and kill them in front of me." And once again you say to me, "Oh no, not one of these parables again. What was wrong with the lost sheep? Like there was a party at the end, and there was a coin, and another party, and then a son and another party." But the last 2 weeks, David, it's just like death and destruction. The parable starts looking like it's going to be really happy, and then at the end, everybody's dead. It's like, did Jesus start collaborating with Quentin Tarantino for a while? Like what's going on here? And Jesus is trying to shock us, I think, in these parables of judgment, because he wants us to kind of get the severity of what's going on here. And this parable, I think perhaps more than many of the parables of Jesus, seems to keep kind of tracking the line between parable and reality. Remember, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. He's about to go and clear the temple. He's about to go and smash up a place that's supposed to be a place of worship, but has become something entirely different. So perhaps this dark aspect of the story is beginning to become apparent to all of those who are around Jesus. But of course, also don't forget the upside down nature of the parable, because Jesus is telling this story about a king, but underlying this second level of this drama is his own story. The shock of that story, remember, is that this king isn't going to kill his enemies. He's going to die for them. So there's a constant contrast being wrestled around within this story. But here's the question I want to ask first about this parable this morning. Essentially, the question is this: why was the king angry? And take a moment with this question. What's the first thoughts that come into your head? Why was the king angry? If you had to jump up from here right now and run off to, children's church because you're now the standby children's church teacher, or you had to jump home just quickly and tell your friends when you got home what this parable was about, what would you say is the answer to the question, why is the king angry? What is the king irritated about? And I want to suggest that it's hard for us to see in our contemporary economic atmosphere. But the important thing for us to do is to ask, well, what did the king ask them to do? What did the king ask of these 10 servants, of whom we only see 3 responding? We only know about these 3, but what had he asked them to do? He asked them to do something with what they had been given. Literally, he asked them to put the money to work, trade with it, do business with it, make the work happen. Do you notice what he didn't ask them to do? He didn't ask them to be successful. He didn't ask them to make 10 times what he'd given them. He didn't ask them for any of those things. He just said, do something with this. And it strikes me that that's an important thing to hang on to in this parable. That we insert our notion based on how the parable ends as to what it is that we think this parable's doing. This parable is teaching us about investment, and this parable is teaching us about return, and this parable is teaching us that if we invest well and return well, this will equal success. But the king had only asked them to do something. And I want to suggest that this third servant's problem isn't laziness. It's not like he failed economics 101 and finds himself thinking, I'm sure if I wrap this money up, it will grow, right? It's not that. Actually, what this servant does, and it's there in the text if you look at it closely, what this servant does wrong is he fails to trust the king. He was afraid of him. He said, I don't think your dealings are good. I don't think you are respectable. I think you are a bad person, essentially what the servant has. He has this perspective of the king, and he thinks he understands the king. And that fear that he has of the king stops him from acting in a world of trust. It stops him from being faithful. It stops him from having belief. In the Greek, it takes away his pistos. And therefore, he stops being trustworthy. He has a flawed view of the king. The king, I want to suggest to you in this parable, doesn't care about the money. The king isn't interested in how much money he's given them. He isn't interested in the volumes that he returns. It strikes me that what the king is interested in is, do these servants trust him and act as trustworthy servants? But this servant, instead of taking that risk, instead of that risk of faith, that risk of trust, that risk of belief, he plays it safe. And as you look at the parable, it probably wasn't the safest way to go. Can you get that vibe just at the end? Instead of risk, he acts in fear. Instead of trust, he does nothing. But at the basis of this, and this moves us into bigger theological questions of Scripture, there's another thing that's going on here, perhaps a bigger problem altogether, is that the servant forgot something fundamentally important to following this parable. The fundamental thing the servant seems to forget is that the money wasn't his. It wasn't his money. It wasn't his to do what he wanted with. It wasn't his to keep. It was his that had been entrusted to him. It was his that had been asked something of it. And it was his decision as to whether to do what had been asked of him. And often we kind of get lost in that in our theology of receiving and giving. And that's why I want to talk about this, because I think this parable is about money. It's about a whole host of things. There's all sorts of things you can ask about in this parable. But I think this parable talks to us about money. That kind of ugly, horrible, awkward conversation that nobody ever wants to talk about. The parable isn't about investment. The parable isn't about return. It isn't about reward. It's about trust. And if we understand trust, if we understand faith and faithfulness, it helps us in a significant understanding of what we might call a biblical theology around money. Because a biblical theology around money begins with one premise. You first have to have a theology of receiving. Too many Christian conversations about money are conversations about giving. And we talk about giving. What's our theology of giving? How generous are we as a people? Where are we giving to? What are we giving into? And these are important and profoundly necessary conversations for us to have. But if we have those conversations first, if we first talk about theology of giving before a theology of receiving, what happens is we end up with all the pieces in the wrong place. Beginning with giving seduces us into believing that what we give to God was ours to begin with. But this parable always wants us to remember that all of the money belonged to the king. But we want to believe that it's ours. We want to believe that this is mine, and because it's mine, I'm going to choose what to do with it. But the Bible ticks to a different beat. A beat that you can go right the way back into the Hebrew Psalms, and you'll find that they knew something different that we often forget. Psalm 50, verse 9 to 12. We hear this in the voice of God, this great Hebrew song, where in this part of the psalm, God says, I have no need of a bull from your stall or of goats from your pens. For every animal of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know every bird in the mountains, and the insects in the fields are mine. If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world is mine and all that is in it. This is the Bible's theology of ownership. Everything is owned by God and remains so permanently. So when God talks about things, they're always his things. When God gives us things, they're always his things. So as a result, the primary position of any human in God's kingdom is that we are not givers, we are receivers. So a theology of receiving reads this parable as an instruction that's very different from what a theology of giving reads this parable of. A theology of giving reads this parable as how to invest and how to get return. A theology of receiving reads this parable as a call to be faithful, as a call to be trustworthy. A theology of receiving constantly remembers that this is more than just about money. It's a question about ownership. What do you really own? Do you own your money? Do you own your possessions? Do you own your family? Do you own your time? And at some level, the parable asks this question with its very dark end. If you own any of it, how come you don't take it with you? How come it is so easily taken from you? So when I do have something, and when I do something with what I have, realistically, I'm not using my stuff, I'm using God's stuff. Whenever I do anything with anything that I have, my time, my possessions, my money, I'm actually making a theological decision, a faith choice, a trust move. A trust move that's rooted in Jesus' doctrine in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 8, which, just for old time's sake, I'm going to go in the King James Version. Freely ye have received, freely give. Here's where Jesus locates himself in this process. And just think about that word for a moment. Freely. If you grasp what all the parables of Jesus are constantly trying to say to you, this word freely echoes constantly throughout them. How did we get these minas in the first place? How did the 10 of us have this 100 days of wages? How did we get it? It was given to us freely. And if we can grasp that we are receivers, then we won't live in a culture of rules and return. We won't live in a culture that says it's mine and I'll do what I want with it and I'll see what comes of it. Instead, we'll live in a context of grace. We'll live in a context of faith and a context of trust. Often as Christians, when it comes to money, we end up teaching prudence rather than faith. We accidentally lean into the wrong lesson. And we end up teaching prudence when, like the man in this parable, we think we understand how God works. We think we understand the rules to the way God does things. We see God moving things around and we assume that maybe this God isn't playing by the rules. Seems like he's taking stuff where he shouldn't take stuff and giving stuff where he isn't giving stuff. If you've ever had the moment where you've said, how come they seem to be blessed and I don't? You're in the position of the man that says, I think you're a thief to the king. Because we assume that for some reason God must be playing by some rules that we are also playing by in his economics. And that's what happens when we then start to teach prudence over faith. We perceive God as the servant's master. And I want to say this very cautiously, so please don't hear what I'm not saying here. But I think within the church, particularly within some of our theologies around finance, particularly with our theology of tithing, it has led us to occasionally do this very thing. That instead of participating in a blessing, instead of participating in the invitation to be part of a kingdom where everything belongs to God, what happens is our theology of giving becomes an invitation to meet a standard. It becomes an invitation to meet a particular line. And if you meet that line, well done, good servant. And if you don't meet that line, well, what was the point in trying and falling short? People who have given regularly and faithfully throughout their lives will sometimes turn around and say, yes, but because I've given this way, I've been blessed. God has blessed me in particular ways, and I'm not going to deny that. But I want to suggest that often the reason that we find ourselves blessed through giving is not because we've met a standard, it's because we've been givers. It's because we've been generous. It's because we've poured out something of what God has poured into us. The problem with creating standards, however, is they create impossible burdens for some people. They create impossible burdens for new people of faith, perhaps, who have just found Jesus and realize, I want to participate in generosity. And the church says it's 10% of your income or nothing. And these people go, I don't know how to do that. I don't know where to get that. But then for other people, 10% of their income, let's be honest, is pretty easy. I was in an ice cream store the other day there. I can't decide whether you're laughing because you looks like I shouldn't be in an ice cream store. Or, it's, so I get my ice cream, my daughter gets her ice cream, my wife gets her ice cream, and we walk along the line as we do, and she tells me the price, and I pull out my card, and she spins the screen down to me, and there's 3 choices, 10%, 15%, 18%. And I noticed that 10% is at the bottom, and I kind of got the vibe, she doesn't want me to push that one. Because 10% is a really bad tip. And yet we make so much about 10%. We go, oh, well, it's in the Bible. It's the way that things are supposed to be. It's about the 10%. 10% doesn't even matter to many of us. Many of us, 10% of our income could just disappear and we possibly wouldn't even notice. For some people, an impossible burden. For other people, not even a stretch of faith. But God calls us to live trustworthy lives. God calls us to live in lives that say everything is God's and I'm going to be faithful with what God has allowed me to participate in. And oftentimes if we just set up arbitrary lines and standards, and particularly when we take those arbitrary lines and standards and we can find biblical basis for them, we say, oh, look, this happened in the temple back then. That must be the way I'm supposed to live in my life right now. But there are many things that happen in the temple that I notice we don't do. Because the New Testament has called us to surpass those things, to move beyond those things, to think differently about those things. And where is the faith if we just are chasing a standard line? The servant makes the mistake that the master never asked him to make money. He just asked him to do business. He asked him to be faithful with it. He asked him to be trustworthy. And I think that oftentimes our lack of generosity, our lack of redistribution of what it is that God has given us, I wonder if it's the same thing for us even today, that it's a lack of trust. I think that's probably been my story. At moments where I've not been generous, at moments where I've not used what God has given me wisely, I think it's been a lack of trust. Do I want to give into a context that leaves me uncertain of what's happening. Do you notice how often we do this? Oh, I don't know if I should give to that. I don't know if I can give to that. And we start to invent reasons as to why not. I don't give money to that person there because who knows what he's going to spend it on. And who knows how that's going to work. And I pull it back, and that seems like a really legitimate reason. Very few people will challenge you on that. When you say, I don't know what they're using the money for. But so often what it actually speaks to is not a generosity problem, but a trust problem. We create these objections, and many of them are pseudo-objections. I'm not sure what they'll do with it. When the actual objection, which is unspoken and often not clarified for us, is the real problem we have is I'm not sure what I'll do without it. If I give this away, where does that leave me? And because we want to live in a culture that so often tells us that you got to make sure that you're okay for a rainy day, it actually starts to kind of close down our world of generosity, and we stop living in trust. But if our giving doesn't involve trust, the Bible seems to awkwardly and uncomfortably lean into us, particularly in a parable like this, and say, is it really giving? Like Jesus said, that even pagans can figure out the tax incentives of giving. Well, he said something like that. Jesus said that even the pagans can figure out giving to each other so that when they give to one, they might eventually get it back one day. But that's just an investment strategy. That's just a rule of return. What does it look like to live in a culture of trust? What does it look like to say, God, everything I have is yours? In 2 Corinthians chapter 9, Paul writes to a church in Corinth. This is not a Jewish church. They don't understand the ways that things work in the world of Israel. They've probably never heard of tithing. And Paul writes to this brand new group of Christians, and this is what he says when it comes to a conversation about finance. He says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly, and whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Each of you should give what you have decided in your heart to give, not reluctantly or under compulsion, for God loves a cheerful giver. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. And he goes on later in verse 12 to say, this service that you perform is not only supplying the needs of the Lord's people, but is also overflowing in many expressions of thanks to God. Now this is a little bit of a nasty couple of verses from Paul, right? It's really cool, because the first time you read this verse, you kind of go, oh wow, this is really cool. Because this means that whole 10% thing, I can really move that on and get beyond that. And that's great, because I don't like how many new shoes that pastor seems to buy. And I'm thinking 5 would be better than 10. Maybe that's what we first think. And then you realize Paul's being really mean with this opening quote. If you want to sow sparingly, you want to reap sparingly. Oh, okay, that's really uncomfortable, Paul. That's not very nice. And then he does a really mean thing. God loves a cheerful giver. Not, and forgive me, those of you that this may apply directly to, not God loves a cheerful accountant. Right? God loves a cheerful tax man. Well, there's no such thing as a cheerful tax man, is there? So, too far? Okay. April is approaching, right? I figured I could roll out this range of tax jokes that I have a whole book of them. God loves a cheerful giver. So decide what you want to do in your heart. Nobody should compel you to do that. You should never do it reluctantly. But what is God doing in your heart? That's a terrifying question, Paul. That's just not nice at all. I remember once in a situation that I was in early in my life, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but I ended up in a situation where I had a job for a year that had no salary, and I'm really good with math, and they offered me the job. I was so excited, and then but anyway, I ended up in this job with no salary, and somebody wrote me a check one day for £500, right, which was massive for me at that particular time, because I'm thinking, I can live for a long time with this. And I did this really dumb thing, because it was totally unexpected. I hadn't expected to get this check for 500. That's UK pounds. That's $1 million, I think. And I had this check, and I wasn't sure what to do with it, right? Because it was unexpected. Like, I hadn't expected to get a check for £500, and I'm looking at it going, I don't know what to do with this. Like, everything seems to be going quite well for me at the minute. And this is the dumb thing that I did. I remember putting it on the table beside my bed and going, hey, God, what am I going to do with this? And then this awful moment happened the next day at work where I saw somebody, and I all of a sudden felt this voice of God, if I can describe it that way, who said, you should give it to her. And I was like, oh man, what a stupid prayer. Like I had it, somebody generously given it to me. I had just helped them live in God's abundance, and here was me trying to pass it on. And I remember this immense freedom of just handing this person what would have kept me going for a few months at that point in my life. And then looking back a few months later and realizing that God had just looked after me through this whole time. And I had spent a year like with no salary. And I found myself, by the end of the year, I'd given away about as much as I'd actually taken in. And I still don't entirely understand how that works if I want to figure out economically. But I found myself living in this passage here, that God can look after you because everything's his. And you can abound in every good work. But notice a couple of things here. The giving isn't automated. It's intentional. It's intentional. Decide in your heart. God has blessed you immensely. What do you want to do with that? You know, in the ice cream store, I'm just processing this out loud for a second. The girl flipped the box around to me and said, you just need to choose which tip you want, 10, 15, or 18. The problem was, we'd had 2 interactions, okay? These were our 2 interactions. Hey, do you mind if I try your cookie dough ice cream? Yeah, sure. Well, this is really nice. Hey, could I have a split scoop? Could I have cookie dough and salted caramel? No. Would you like to choose your tip? I'll be honest, I wasn't in the mood to tip. We'd had 2 interactions, and no had been the answer to what I felt was a reasonable request. I did give her a tip, just so you know. It wasn't 18%. But I wasn't a cheerful tipper. I wasn't generous in my attitude. I was kind of grumpy. And to be honest with you, let me just really, the darkness of my soul, I just pushed one of the tip buttons because she was stood watching me. And I wasn't brave enough to go 0. Next time, split the ice cream. But I wasn't brave enough to do that, so I reluctantly just punched the 15 button and shamefully walked out with my single flavor. And I won't tell you what ice cream store I was in, but don't go to Mardeloop for ice cream anymore. Notice what Paul says. The service is practical. It supplies needs. Like sometimes we just got to get down to the basics, you know, like things cost money. And like God doesn't need your money, but at the same time what we're doing always requires us to invest and trust and invest in the sense of the generosity that God's poured out on us. But notice, the service is practical. It supplies needs, but it's also worshipful. It's part of our thanks to God that we say, God, thank you, because it's practical, it's worshipful, and it's not compelled. And that's where we want to live as a community. Practical, but worshipful. Like you'll hear in a lot of the times throughout Westside, like here's what we're spending money on. Like it's really practical stuff. It's like light bulbs and salaries and heating systems and, you know, and relaying the parking lot because of our great ministry to drifters. And like the drifters in the cars. We have another ministry to different types of drifters. Like these things cost money. They're just really practical things. It's unfortunately the way the world seems to work that things cost money. But we also want our generosity to be worshipful, that you can invest of what God has poured on you into practical things and that be worshipful. But we got to do that without being manipulative. So Westside wants to choose to be factual. Rather than being manipulative, just going, here's where we're up to. If you were with us on our vision night just a couple of weeks ago, you'll have heard a finance report that was practical. It was factual. It wasn't manipulative. It was just, here's where it is. And there's an invitation to step into that with us. You know, factual and manipulative are very different things. Manipulative says, hey, come on, let's see what God's doing and what can we empty out of our wallets. Factual says, do you know what? At Westside, giving's down at the moment. And that's just a fact. That's not a manipulative fact, it's just a fact. And we're not down by a couple of bucks, it's probably closer to a couple of $100,000. The giving's down. And that's a fact. And that impacts us. That impacts us when you have to pay bills and look after salaries and deal with parking lots and put roofs back together and so on and so forth. Here's a really interesting fact. Our giving down, our attendance isn't. This got awkward real quick, didn't it? So where does that leave us? Now, we know the whole city is in this awkward economic. We totally respect that. Our team, I'm amazed by the way our team squeeze finance down and make things work for hugely bargain prices. But God owns everything, says the text. So where do we want to live as a people? Where do I want to live? Where do you want to live? I don't want to say anything other than that. Because the beautiful thing about Paul's text in 2 Corinthians is it's not a standard that the church sets that you have to reach. It's just a question that you and God work out between yourselves. And you figure that out because God can do incredible things with trust. It's not guilt motivated, well, I suppose I better do it because that's the rules. It's not fear motivated, well, I'm going to wrap this up in a cloth and give it back and say, well, I was scared of you, so I didn't do anything with it. But rather, what we find in Scripture is an invitation to live generously. And a theology of receiving. Do you know what's the greatest thing a preacher could ever say to everyone? Is that we live as receivers. But the moment we talk about money, it becomes so bound up in the nerves of social impropriety that nobody wants to say anything about it. It's like, oh, God, this is awkward. But here's the biblical text. Everything you have is God's and a gift from him, and he can look after you. So a little bit of practical stuff for you real quick. How can you give at Westside? Well, there's a variety of options. You can give online. Just go to the website. That internet voodoo thing where we're claiming it back for Jesus. And wkc.org/giving, and also through the journal app on the give button there, you can give through PayPal. It's uber secure. PayPal seems to be one of the sort of kind of foremost safe giving things. You're just going to set this up over the next little while. We're also going to have giving stations set up around the room where you can pay by debit or credit or check or cash. So you can physically give on site and you can give remotely as well. That can be one-off or that can be regular. And we appreciate all of that. Westside predominantly runs on the people who regularly commit to us, but we also appreciate people who give as and when they are able to. You can claim your tax back. Ignore my comment about pagans earlier. You can claim your tax back for giving to WKC. Let me just say this as well. It is severely private. Right? We know that giving is private, and it should be private. There's a very small team of financially qualified people who see what it is that you do. Those people aren't the pastors. So I don't know what you give, you don't know what I give, and that will always remain that way. The ability to give privately without judgment or fear is hugely important to us, and we want to keep working in that. Do you notice what's missing? Offering buckets. Because we took them out. As we roll into Easter, we want to transition away from the offering bucket. It's a little bit awkward, let's be honest. There's that moment where, somebody passes this bucket past, and now you're trying to decide, like you've given already via the internet, but now you're trying to decide, I want everyone to look like I don't give and I don't care, and this empty bucket walks along, and then everybody looks at the $10 that's in there and goes, man, this church runs for cheap. And and then there's always at least a kid, or maybe it's a kid that goes, well, you know what, actually, I could use $10, and it's really nice of them to offer it to us. It also feels a little like begging. Like we've been doing it for years in church, but it feels a little like begging. It doesn't feel intentional. It doesn't feel practical, and let's be truthful, it doesn't always feel like worship. So as we approach Easter, we're going to transition away from the offering bucket and have these giving stations around the church. And we just want to encourage us to live remembering that if your giving normally involves dropping in a bucket, we just ask you to attend one of those giving stations at an appropriate moment throughout your time with us on a Sunday, and you can give to there. You can give through debit, credit, check, cash, any form of giving, your firstborn son, a tenth of your harvest, all We just want to make it easy, private, safe, and secure for us to live in the generosity that God calls us to. So money is about trust, and money is about following Jesus. The results could be a great many things, but what the master in the parable was interested in was, did you do something with what I gave you? And there's a weird anomaly in church, and I want to say this just as we land this morning. The weird anomaly in the church seems to be that how often we become the third guy. Yeah, I have opinions about what you do. I have opinions about how you think. I have opinions about what it is that you've got going on. And here's an anomaly that I notice in church, and this may be a really offside comment, but I'm just going to throw it out there. It strikes me as amazing that the people who most talk about the injustices and most talk about the unfairness and most talk about everything that's wrong are often the people sat on the bench, the people who are not doing anything about it. Having an opinion about how things should be done is not the same as doing something. Like, here's your minna back in a cloth because I have some thoughts about you. Or there's the people who move and operate in trust and move and operate in just faithfulness that what has been given to them, they want to do remarkable things with. And that takes us back to the start. As they were hearing these things, remember I told you to pay attention to that. What things were they hearing? Where were they? Who's Jesus talking to? What's going on in this parable, this awkward parable about coins? Who is it that Jesus would inflict this particular discourse on? Well, if you looked back, you'll notice that they're sat in a man's house. The man's name is Zacchaeus. And as they're sat in Zacchaeus' house, a man who has just bankrupted himself to put things right, a man who has just paid back double what he took from people, who has scammed people for his whole life and has an encounter with Jesus and seems to immediately flip into a theology of Psalm 50, where everything is God's. And this corrupt, low-life tax collector who had just met Jesus steps into a life of trust. It's hard to understand the story of Zacchaeus unless you read the parable afterwards. And you realize that if God owns everything, all he wants us to do is trust him with everything. For Zacchaeus, it wasn't a theory, it wasn't an opinion. It was actual, practical worship, or perhaps just real, honest trust. So may you trust Jesus like Zacchaeus did. May his grace and peace be on you. Thank you.